The second episode of Doctor Who Season 1 has aired alongside the first, but was it any good? Okay, so as mentioned, this episode, The Devil's Chord, aired on the same day as episode 1, Space Babies, which I reviewed last week. If you want to see the review for that episode, I'll make sure to have it linked in the corner and at the end of this video. But this video is going to be a review for episode 2, The Devil's Chord. This episode sees the Doctor and Ruby travel to 1963 to see the Beatles, but they come face to face with Maestro, who is changing history by removing music from people's hearts, leaving the future of humanity at stake. But was this episode any good? Okay, so this episode opens with a very classic Russell T Davies cold open, introducing us to the main villain of the episode, Maestro, who I think is a great villain, portrayed incredibly by Jinx Monsoon, who I just think did an incredible job in this episode. I know for some people the performance is a little bit over the top, but for me personally, I think it works perfectly for this episode. Although Jinx Monsoon has recently come out as trans, the character of Maestro is stated to be non-binary in the cold open of this episode. Now, let me know if I'm speaking out of turn here, but I think the non-binary nature of this character really works in their favour, as after all they are a godlike entity, being the child of the toy maker. So them being non-binary I think really works to show how powerful and out of this world this character is, if that makes sense. They're a sort of nebulous entity, so I think making them non-binary and giving them that non-binary identity really helps to reinforce that. And like I just mentioned, Maestro is confirmed to be a child of the toy maker and part of the pantheon and a god of chaos, which I think is a really clever way of setting the stakes of this villain and a really easy way to relay to the audience how powerful of a force they are, as anybody who's seen the 60th anniversary specials and particularly the Giggle knows just how powerful this character should be if they are a child of the toy maker. And this also really helps to reinforce the Doctor's fear when he figures out who Maestro is and that they're related to the toy maker with the Giggle early on in the episode. Okay, so the first scene we get after the cold open and the title sequence is with the Doctor and Ruby, and this is one of my favourite scenes we've had of them so far. Once again, their dynamic is on full display, with the Doctor pretending he doesn't like Ruby's suggestion of going to see the Beatles to actually trick her and show how happy he is that she said that. I also love the moment and the shot we get of them changing into their 1960s outfits, even though it is a bit weird that Ruby is already in an outfit that wouldn't seem out of place in the first place. But like I said, it allows for us to have that really nice moment and that great shot of them changing into their outfits, which I think is one of the best directed shots we've had in the season so far. Now, the weird thing about this episode is there is a 6-month time jump for some reason, which I think was a very odd mention in the script, and for me personally it's not really a good decision for the second episode of the season. I've seen some people mention that this might have been done to have a gap for Big Finish and other expanded media, which is fine, but if so, I feel like it should have been done later on in the season than it was here, because we're just getting used to the characters and we really want to see their relationship develop in these early episodes. So I think having a 6-month time jump in between episode 1 and 2 was a pretty big mistake in my opinion. I've seen some people speculate that this episode was originally intended to be later in the season, which I think is definitely likely. However, Ruby suggesting to go and see the Beatles early on in this episode sounds like it would have been her first request after their first adventure in Space Babies. And my personal theory for how this episode was going to start is that it was going to take place immediately after the first episode, with this adventure being Ruby's first suggestion after their first adventure, which would also have justified the 2-episode premiere, as these episodes could have taken place immediately after each other, which would have made a lot more sense in my opinion. And I'm personally surprised they didn't just ADR the scene where June or July of 2024 is mentioned instead of Christmas, because I'm pretty sure the Doctor is both far away enough and maybe even facing away from the camera that I think an overdubbed line in the scene would have worked pretty seamlessly. We also get mentions of the Doctor's granddaughter Susan in this episode, which I believe is the first time she's been properly mentioned by name in all of the New Era, although I guess this is technically another New Era anyway. Now, most of the exposition so far has been something that is important for the new audience to know and catch them up to speed, which this isn't. So it does feel like this is something that wouldn't be mentioned unless it's going to be brought up again later on in the season. And we do know that Susan Twist is playing a character called Susan Triad in the finale, so it's possible that there's a connection there, and maybe we're going to see Susan later on in the season, or Susan's going to be Susan Triad or related to Susan Triad or something along those lines. But let me know what you think about that in the comments below. We also have some more hints at Ruby's story arc in this episode, with more memories bleeding through into reality like in the previous episode, and Maestro mentions a character called the Oldest One who was apparently present during Ruby's birth. I know some people have been speculating recently that this could be the Trickster. I'm not sure how likely that is, but let me know what you think about that in the comments down below. And Maestro once again reminds us that the one who waits is coming, which some people have speculated could be Sutek, which I'd love if that was true, but I don't know how likely that is. Again, let me know what you think about that in the comments down below. But this could be more evidence that this episode was meant to air later in the season, possibly right before the finale, as I'm pretty sure Maestro says the one who waits is closer than we think, so you'd think that'd be a bit later on in the season. Obviously, this episode sees the Doctor and Ruby going to see the Beatles record their first album, only for them to see that the Beatles, Cilla Black, and this orchestra are all playing terrible music, which I think makes for one of the best moments in this whole episode. I love both of their reactions to all of the musicians playing terrible music. I think it's a hilarious moment of the episode, and I think the Ruby and Doctor's reactions are perfect. Although the quote-unquote bad music that the Beatles are playing honestly isn't too far off something the Beatles would have made. Think I Am the Walrus or Octopus's Garden, but it's still a hilarious moment nonetheless. Speaking of the Beatles, I knew they weren't going to feature heavily in this episode. My prediction was that they would be trapped in their instruments most of the episode, and so I don't really mind that much that they don't look a whole lot like the Beatles. However, I do think it is really unfortunate that George and Ringo are pretty much sidelined for this episode, with us only focusing on John and Paul. But with that being said, I do really like the conclusion to the threat being those two coming together to play the chord that banishes Maestro. And of course, this episode ends with a final big musical number. Now, for me personally, I'm not the biggest fan of musicals, but I was expecting a musical number in this episode and was personally quite excited for it because I wanted to see how they'd do it, and it's something new for Doctor Who. However, the musical number at the end of this episode just didn't work for me. It didn't feel justified in the plot at all for me and just felt ultimately a bit tacked on. And the song itself just also isn't very good. It's nearly as bad as the made up bad songs earlier on in the episode. I've seen some people suggest that it should have been used to defeat Maestro in the music battle instead, which, although being more justified in the plot, I personally wouldn't have preferred that, as I think the music battle sequence is perfect as it is, besides that one cringy music battle line. It also doesn't really make sense in the plot, as Maestro has already been defeated, so we're kind of left questioning why this is happening in the first place. I think the intention was meant to be that Maestro's domain was still lingering, like at the end of the giggle. I'm pretty sure I've heard there was a line from the script that was not included or something like that that hinted at that, but I think there really needed to be a line or two in the episode explaining that, because it just wasn't clear and made the musical number feel even more tacked on than it already was. Overall, I think this was a very good episode of the show with a great villain in Jinx Monsoon's Maestro. It is almost up there with Wild Blue Yonder for me. However, it's slightly let down by the tacked on musical number at the end, which doesn't have much of a function in the plot, and by some poor mistakes in either editing or episode placement, with that 6-month time jump and potentially other things that were cut from the episode. If I were to rank this episode on a tier list, I'm mostly thinking I'd give it an A rank at the moment, but it could go down to a B rank depending on if my thoughts on it change a little bit later on down the line, and depending on the later episodes of this season, depending on how good they are. But for now, I'm going to put it at A rank, but maybe that'll change later on down the line. Like I said at the start of this video, I've already released my review for episode 1, Space Babies. If you want to watch that, I'll make sure to have it linked at the end of this video. At the time I'm recording this video, Boom hasn't aired yet, but by the time this video comes out, I will already have seen it, and I'll have maybe done a first impressions video on it, and the review for that should be out next week, as well as potentially the review for 73 Yards, depending on when I can get that made. So if you don't want to miss them, make sure you subscribe.